Here at the Canadian Club, we have always been a forum for public figures, thought leaders, and decision makers to share their ideas and inform the most relevant and compelling conversations of our time.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Joseph Lowe, President of Canadian Club Toronto. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Our meeting place remains the home of over 70,000 diverse Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. Indigenous peoples are the original caretakers of Turtle Island, and for that reason, we are grateful for the opportunity to gather and converse today. Guests, thank you so much for joining us and welcome. And thank you to our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications, and LiveMeeting.ca for making this all possible. With over $2 trillion in business assets projected to be sold over the next decade, Canada is seeing its largest wave of business owner retirements in history. Today, our expert panel will discuss the US and UK experience of employee ownership trusts, one of the most newly popular business succession tools, and how Canadian governments and the private sector can work together to build better economic outcomes for our workers and our communities. Now, just before we hear from today's panel, I'd like to review a couple of housekeeping items. First off, to pose a question, you'll see the question tab on the right-hand side of your screen. Hit that, and your question will be sure to be sent through to our moderator. The help button located in the lower right-hand corner of the screen is there for technical support if you do have any questions. I'd also like to take a moment to thank today's sponsors, Stikeman Elliott, for helping to make this event possible. And thank you, as always, to our season sponsor, Canadian Bankers Association, for its ongoing support in our 125th year. Canadian Club is a nonprofit, and we've been gathering people together for 125 years. And it's because of our sponsors, partners, and our members in our community that we were able to do so. So thank you to all of you for your support and encouragement through the years. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers of the day. Christine Cooper, Executive Vice President and Head, BMO Commercial Bank, Canada. Chad Friesen, CEO, Friesen's Corporation. Tim Masson, Chief Steward and CEO, Ray's Recruiting. Cindy Turcotte, CEO and President, Gardner's Supply Company. And today's discussion moderator, Matthew Mendelsohn, Senior Advisor at Boston Consulting Group. Now, a tradition that our club maintains to this day is a toast that we make at the beginning of our event. So if you have a beverage in hand, please join me in our toast to Canada. Canada. Matthew, it's my pleasure to hand the Canadian Club podium, and Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Joseph. It's my pleasure to take it. So many of us, including myself, have been thinking about how to make capitalism more inclusive, how to make economic growth more inclusive, how to make wealth creation more inclusive. And one of the key pieces is employee ownership, and specifically employee ownership trusts that we're going to talk about today. And the people on this panel all have deep experience thinking about these issues. We're at a particularly important moment because the Canadian government, the federal government, in the 2021 budget and the 2022 budget made kind of subsequent commitments around creation of employee ownership trusts, and those consultations are all ongoing. A broad-based coalition of Canadian leaders from across diverse sectors, community sector, business sector, academic sector, have come together to encourage the government to continue moving forward in this direction, and also make sure that they get the policy design right, because that's really important. Employee ownership has been very successful in many other countries. We are going to talk about the UK and the US in particular, but probably some others as well. And right now, for example, there is $1.7 trillion in assets owned by 14 million Americans through their version of employee ownership trusts. As I say, the 2022 federal budget committed to the creation of a new dedicated tax trust structure, an employee ownership trust under the Income Tax Act to support employee ownership of business. And it's really important that right now we get together and make sure that they get this right. So before we jump into it with our panelists, I did want to just give a definition for our purposes of what an employee ownership trust is. They are very popular legal structures in many other countries that make it easy for a business owner to sell their company to their employees. Every employee becomes a shareholder of the company through this trust, and they become a shareholder for free. The reason employees don't have to pay for their shares is that the transaction is funded by debt, mostly or completely provided by the former owners themselves. The debt is then paid down out of future company cash flow. And once the debt is paid out, the company belongs to the trust, who owns it on behalf of the employees of the business. How the employees benefit from the trust depends on policy design, but it could take the form of paid dividends every year, or employees selling their stake in the trust when they leave the company or retire. And many companies that people in this audience would be familiar with have gone through this transition, like Bob's Red Mill and Taylor Guitars, and a big supermarket in Florida, Publix supermarket, which is kind of the size of Loblaws, and results in employees, some retiring with over $1 million in wealth through their share account. So a couple of notes before we get going, just to make sure we're all on the same page. This broad-based coalition that has come together, we've been using the general term employee ownership trust to include both the UK model and the American model. The American model is usually referred to as an ESOP, but we've been using the umbrella term to describe both of these. And the key for both the US and the UK models, even though they have some differences in feature and design, they have clear legal structures, they have targeted incentives to make them viable, and they are relatively simple to set up. If we want business owners to transition to ownership for their employees, we need simple structures and incentives to ensure that businesses have options other than selling to private equity or often foreign-owned competitors. So with that, I'm really excited to engage with our panelists, all of whom have different kinds of experience and engagement with employee ownership. So let's get to it. I'm going to start with Tim and Chad, and maybe Tim, Chad, I'll start with you first. Why are you here? What are your kind of personal and professional stories that bring you to focus on employee ownership trusts? And maybe you can tell us a bit about your business.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. Frieson's Corporation has been in business since 1907. So we're one of the oldest companies, definitely in Western Canada. And we're in the business of helping other people get their best story out to the world. And we do that through the power of print. And so we produce many books, packaging, and work with authors to self-publish their titles. And so why am I here? We are, I think, as far as the coalition, I think we're an example of how employee ownership has had a positive impact on a business and a community over an extended period of time. And so we've had some form of employee ownership since, goes back to the 1950s. And we've actually been owned in a number of different employee ownership models since then. And so I'm here because employee ownership has had a profound influence on our business, on our community, and on our region. And I believe very strongly that Friesens probably doesn't exist in southern Manitoba. That's where we're based, in Altona, Manitoba. I don't believe we exist here today if it had not been for the vision and generosity of the original Friesen family to be able to transition our company from family ownership to employee ownership. And that second generation of family owners looked down the path, and they said fourth and fifth generation family run businesses are really rare. And so they had that foresight and influence. They were very influenced by the cooperative movement of the day. And so they were very highly motivated to try and set a path for the company that would ensure its longevity. And so that set in motion this tremendous gift for the employees of the day, the employees of the future, and ultimately for the community and the region as well. And so with a little help, and this is one of the reasons why we're part of the coalition, with a little help, we believe that employee ownership can replicate and repeat stories like ours across the country, and ensure that businesses can continue their legacy and continue contributing to their community and to their employees like ours has. But it's not an easy transition. It wasn't an easy transition. It took decades for our company to transition through. And so there's an opportunity for us as a country to make it easier for employee ownership to be a real answer to the succession challenges that we're facing. And so that's what we're here for. We're here to pay it forward. We received a gift of employee ownership, and we're here to pay it forward and help other companies to make that transition as well.
Thanks, Chad. That's very useful context and the benefits for employees and communities. And I'm going to come back later to the question of how to make it easier, because obviously it's worked for you. And so I think we'll talk more in a little bit about how it could be easier for other companies to do that without necessarily quite the level of struggle that it may have taken at Friesens.
Sure.
But you were talking about second generation, third generation transitions and transitions to new ownership and different divergent paths that those could take, which brings us to Tim, who I know you are thinking about these questions kind of deeply as you think about your business, but perhaps you can tell us about kind of your stage trajectory thinking at your firm.
Yeah, so our company's been around a long time as well. We were co-founded in 1957 by my grandmother, and my dad bought the business actually in a similar transaction to the kind of one we're talking about here. It's called a leverage buyout, where my grandmother and her business partner funded the transition to him through debt. And I obviously grew up around the business, so did my siblings, but all of us were encouraged actually to look at other paths and other ways. And we were all in different paths. Particularly, my career was in tech for the first decade. And my dad's health declined kind of in an untimely way in his early 60s. And so the business was there, and I needed to help my parents figure out what the transition was going to look like. And just around that time, I started learning about something called B corporations or benefit corporations, and this whole idea of stakeholder capitalism. And certainly the idea that business could make a positive social contribution was one that I found really inspiring and really exciting. So I ended up getting involved, did a similar leverage buyout process, and transitioned the business. At the time, it was about 100 million in revenue with 100 employees. So sizable, complex and challenging for me to take on, certainly as a 32-year-old at the time. Probably way over my skill set and capability at the time. And so the last decade and a half has been a real learning opportunity. But I've really, what we focused on most was that idea of stakeholder capitalism, bringing employees in, teaching an ownership mindset, turning financials, inside out, from being very private in a private corporation to being, we're probably more public than most public corporations with our employees, and encouraging them to understand the business and get involved in how to continue to evolve it. So it's been an incredible ride, ups and downs, but we're now actually at 400 million and 400 employees. And so we've almost 4x the business over the last decade and a half. And I think, there's two parts for me. One, is you look at transition over time, how do you do that? And as someone who's passionate about stakeholder capitalism, recognizing that our employees have been critical to this growth that we've experienced over the last 4 years, it seems, the last 12 and a half years, it seems that the only option for me that doesn't feel like selling my soul, if I were to sell or transition the business, would be to sell it to employees. And it's honestly too large and complex to think about transitioning through the family ongoing, which I think is why often family businesses make it to a maximum of 3 generations. So I'm passionate about this subject and this topic. The challenge is that it's very difficult, and I know a lot of other business owners that have gone through an employee ownership transition in Canada, and it's been close to a disaster because of the complex structures that are required, kind of the workarounds, and honestly, the lack of incentives. Something else that I'm totally passionate about is, this is a great this is a great opportunity for Canadian society. And in order for it to scale, we kind of need all parties, including government, to kind of come to the table and be supportive of this type of transition, so that we don't lose the value in the businesses that we have as Canadians to global private equity or global multinationals, which realistically are the only 2 other options for where our business would transition to when I get to the end of my career.
Thank you, Tim. That likewise is great context as you think through these things and situating it really in the emerging conversation that is going on globally and very much in Canada, which is about stakeholder capitalism and ensuring capitalism is working for communities and for workers. And so I appreciate all of that insight. And every story is different, but I'd like to turn to Cindy now, who is a business owner herself, or an employee-owned business, but also has been the past chair of the American Association of Employee Ownership Businesses. So she has great insight into kind of the politics of this and the history of it, and the challenges and opportunities. So first, Cindy, I'd just like to ask you if these stories sound familiar to you, and if they are aligned with some of your experience in the United States and the hopes and goals of business owners in the US who've transitioned to employee ownership.
Absolutely. I'll just a little bit about Gardner's Supply just to start, because even our employee ownership is a little bit different than many, even in the States, because we started our ESOP not long after we became a company. We started in 1983, and we are Gardners.com. You can buy through the web, and we have retail stores. But so back, we had about 30 employees back in, we started in 1983, and our owner, who was in his late 30s at the time, started in the US. It's called an ESOP, an employee stock ownership program. And we started actually very small, and we just bought bits and bobs along the way, and until we became 100% employee owned through an ESOP in 2009. And our owner was very much about wealth equality, that we should own a piece of the business that we work in, that we would be more productive and interested in our retention, and all of those things that are very positive. Was really important, and is really what became true. And what started as just employee ownership and wealth equality eventually became our ownership succession in 2009. So a lot of ESOPs or employee ownership does do it more in a bigger lump than we did it. But so we have a lot of experience over a long period of time of all of the different incentives and different pieces and parts that happen in the US. And so we can talk about those a little bit later. But I've been very involved in the employee ownership world for a long time, because I do believe that we want to keep the wealth and the employees in the communities that we live in. And if Gardner's Supply had gotten bought by a strategic buyer or venture capital, they most certainly wouldn't have kept us in Vermont, which is in the Northeast, and we would have gotten moved more centrally, our call center, our distribution center. So it is absolutely a part of stabilization of community. So I think that's one piece that is really important to look at. I also was the founding chair of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center. And when we get a little further into this conversation about what can you do to talk, how do you get the message out about employee ownership? This is a really important piece to talk about, is how do you get local people talking about employee ownership so people even know it's an option. I also did serve as the chair of the ESOP Association out of Washington, D.C., which is our largest national organization on employee ownership. And so we're talking about all the issues of employee ownership incentives, doing the advocacy, the political work. So we can get into more of that also, because it's very bipartisan in the US. It's a great topic for us to talk about. And also now I'm the chair of the Employee Ownership Foundation. So the foundation does research, sponsors things like this. The Oxford Symposium on International Employee Ownership. And so it's the nonprofit arm of the ESOP Association. So I'm also very involved in that piece too. So I look forward to it. We're also a B Corp. And I really resonate with everything that Tim and Chad talk about. All of those things are absolutely true for Gardner Supply, but I am involved with hundreds of companies across the US and very involved in both the advocacy and the incentive part. So happy to answer questions as we go along.
That's great. Thank you, Cindy. And I know people are going to take you up on that. Just so people know, if you're watching me, I'm not texting with my kids. I'm checking questions as they come in on the phone. So we've got a number of questions already, and certainly, Cindy, some of them will be for you as we go forward. And the point that you make about communication and advocacy and publicity, having the wider public understand these as options, but also as business owners understand these as options. And that's part of the reason that, the federal legislation and changes to legislation are so important, because those create foundations, and then investment community and supporters can help, mobilize and direct business owners and provide advice to them with this as a real option. I want to turn to Christine now and just ask you, as you reflect on the conversation so far, if this resonates with what you hear in the United States. I know BMO is very active in lending to employee-owned companies in the US. And if as you think about that, I did want to ask you a question that just came in from an audience member, which is around how appropriate these are for smaller or medium-sized owned companies. So my understanding is that an employee ownership trust is ideal for smaller or medium-sized companies, but perhaps you can lend us a little bit more expertise or experience on that question.
Sure. Thanks so much, Matthew, for that question. And I think it is interesting because BMO has been very active in this space for over 40 years in the US, and we have a very large team in the US. And when I took over my job about 6 years ago and was studying the differences between US and Canada, I was wondering why it was so big in the US and it wasn't in Canada. And so it's given me some time and opportunity to really understand, what is the difference between Canada and the US, and where is that opportunity? And I think that it's been such a significant business for us in the US because the outcomes are so strong. And Cindy and Chad spoke about this, but there's positive outcomes for local economies and for the workers. It really is a proven public policy. And so I think our customers in the US and our business owners like to do it because it keeps the businesses in the local communities. Chad and Cindy spoke a lot about that. It provides those opportunities for local talent. It increases employee retention. Another thing that we've learned a lot about is the importance of the employee-owned business for resilience through economic uncertainty. And we know that employee owners are more engaged, they're more accountable, there's higher retention, improved performance. And there's studies in the US that were done through the 2001 and 2008 recession that proved this point: fewer bankruptcies, fewer liquidations. They have more staying power. So they benefit the local economies, they benefit the workers, they have staying power. There's so many positive things that it really just does start to beg the question. Are there different motivations or goals of Canadian business owners? And clearly, I think the answer is no. And we're going to hear, from Chad and Tim about that today. I think what we're missing in Canada is really the structure that's targeted at succession. And right now, as Tim spoke to, when an owner wants to sell and there's no family member to pass it down to, there's really only two options: to sell to private equity or to sell to a competitor. It's very difficult and expensive right now to do it in Canada. And I think, just to get to kind of the final part of your question, Matthew, we think that, it will be important in how it's set up to ensure, that it's simple and easy and has the effective tax incentives to ensure that it's applicable for small businesses, mid-size and large businesses, because it can be very beneficial for small businesses as well as large businesses. But the key is to make it simple, not complicated, set out clear rules. And I'm sure we're going to get into that more, but absolutely it can benefit very small businesses as well as large businesses. And the key is to set it up properly so that we can have that same outcome in Canada that we're seeing in the US.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at, thank you very much. That's useful, and certainly my understanding of the structure as being quite useful and appropriate for smaller and medium-sized businesses going through those kinds of transitions. And there are a number of technical questions that are coming in, and we'll probably take some of them, but given our time, we're not going to go deep into any specific thing. And I would encourage people to take a look at the Coalition's website, where there are more technical documents and technical advice on how these can be set up in the most appropriate ways for workers and communities, and they are different than kind of ordinary stock plans that employees can buy in sometimes in their employer, or a stock option where that they can exercise at a later time. And so there are important differences, and this is a much more ambitious model of transition to employee ownership than just the ability for employees to have stock options, for example. Christine, in your discussion there, you started to focus on outcomes, and I'd be interested in Cindy's view on this as well, given your experience with many employee ownership businesses, whether the kinds of things that Christine was talking about, whether there are other things that you think make employee-owned businesses different in terms of the outcomes they pursue. Does it change the way the business operates in any substantial way? I think people would be interested in your experience on those.
Yes. Well, certainly you don't have to, right? You don't have to do it any differently if you don't want to. But all of the statistics show that if you take an employee-owned company and you make it a participatory, not a democratic, but a participatory work environment, that you will have a better outcome financially, culturally, all of that. So there is definitely correlation about having a really great work environment. And Christine spoke a little bit about some of the data back in the recession. And if you look at the data in the pandemic, and the foundation did part of this Employee Ownership Foundation, you can look at it on our site. But during COVID, there was a 4-to-1 gain over employee-owned companies versus non-employee that retained their jobs and then kept people's hours and had more protective measures. And if you just look at that data, you have all those people who aren't going out on unemployment. They're not going, so you always, when you look at these incentives, you have to look at what those incentives are doing to create this wealth equality and costs that the government may not have to pay down the road for other things like unemployment. And so I think this connection to how employee-owned companies take care of employees, because that's who's the shareholder, right? Or the beneficiary of the shareholder. So I know culturally, we're all trying to do a really good job of making connection for our employees with our management teams, and how are we making sure that people understand that the work that we do has a direct benefit on the value in our accounts, in our employee ownership accounts. And so we spend a lot of time trying to make those two connections. So there's the connections, and then there's your community. I mean, if you were to look at employee-owned companies and the communities that they work in, and the volunteerism and the money that they're putting into their communities, I think is very noticeable too. So I think the connection of people, planet, profit, are all intertwined. We are not there at the service of a venture capital or a strategic buyer. We're there because we're loving the work that we do, and we're in the communities we want to be in. Did that answer your question?
I think it did. But I'll turn to Chad and Tim next. But Chad, why don't I go to you first in terms of your sector, which you talked about a bit, but there's obviously a lot of consolidation going on in many sectors, including yours. And I am wondering whether in terms of outcomes that one can achieve through employee ownership, whether you think this structure can act as a check on some of the negative outcomes that we see in various industries, like consolidation, like ownership by those outside the community.
Yeah, certainly, Matthew, there's been consolidation in our industry for the last couple of decades for sure. And it's interesting that some of our chief competitors in the print business are actually employee-owned companies that have been managed to weather some of the economic challenges that the industry has gone through. Very much to Cindy's point of employee-owned companies have a easier path and a better narrative with their employees when it comes to belt tightening, times of trouble, crisis, etc. But maybe I think what I might be able to add more so than our industry perspective would be sort of a small community microcosm. I know I look terribly young, but I've been around for a while, and in a small community we can see, unlike maybe in a larger urban center, in a smaller community we can see turnover happening, succession of businesses, and we're able to actually witness good family-run businesses that maybe are multi-generational, but then when it comes time to get out of the business, it is often the case where they're sold to interests that are out of the community. And so phase one is really the financial transaction. Phase two is you lose a bunch of your senior leadership roles within the business that heads somewhere else, and so the community loses some of the highest paying roles within the business. And then slowly you start to see some of the succession of employees and consolidation of employees to other places. And we've seen it at a local level. We've seen it over and over and over again as businesses have transitioned. And so I think that's it's an interesting perspective, because we have small communities that scattered all over Canada. And many of them you walk through and you talk to the mayor, you talk to somebody, and they're going to have a large employer that is really the cornerstone for the community. And I think that's ultimately, I don't believe it's necessarily industry specific. I think it crosses all sectors, that it's more of a generational challenge that we have ahead of us that we can answer with it, rather than specifically in an industry.
Thank you for that, Chad. That's such an important point, and it connects to discussions that have been implicit here, but I'm really glad that you've made them explicit, because part of this overall agenda is about community wealth and community resilience and the vibrancy of many smaller and medium-sized communities that rely on anchor institutions, which can be family-owned businesses that have been there for generations. And there are a lot of people who are thinking about this and working on this. And to me, the employee ownership model, is a really important lever in contributing to the resilience and vibrancy of local community economies. If I can turn to Tim now, and as you think about selling your business, you've already talked about or transitioning your business in a number of ways, some of the values and preoccupations and goals that you have. But I am curious about your worries or concerns, and how do you think employee ownership might change the nature of your business or respond to those concerns?
Yeah, I think we've been experimenting over the last 12 or 13 years that I've been doing this along the lines of creating an ownership culture and ownership mentality. I was on a presentation like this a decade ago, and I think Cindy referenced some of these statistics where in the US, employee-owned companies outperform non-employee-owned companies, but especially when they have an employee ownership culture. So you need to have Cindy called it a participatory culture. We call it, distributed decision-making or self-management. Those are terms that we would use. But, the idea is that people understand the context of the business and take responsibility for their individual roles and how those intersect and interact with other people in the business so that we lead the business and move it forward together. We, as a company, we've already implemented over the last couple of years a broad-based employee profit sharing program, which is, an incentive that's benefited employees greatly. And so I think, Matthew, like when I think about what I'm worried about, honestly, the thing I'm most worried about is that I'm on this panel and I've publicly committed to pursuing employee ownership over time. I've publicly committed to it in the Globe and Mail, and I'm worried that the policy and the structures won't be in place in Canada that make it, feasible and easy to transition our business to employee ownership. So it's probably the biggest thing I'm worried about, because to me, we've already proved the value of employee engagement and employee ownership mindset in our business. It's just actual equity participation, which is the sort of the last mile for us.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I'd like to ask Christine about this same question, but also to maybe prod on a couple of issues that people on this panel may know about or may not know about, and we can get back to people about, because a lot of technical questions are coming in. And Christine, you may or may not be in a good position to answer these. Cindy, you may have some knowledge of these in the US. And again, the coalition itself has a number of principles and goals and things that we have been advocating for. But there are a number of technical pieces which are policy questions that we're encouraging around government, but that will be important for the government to make decisions on. But Christine, I wanted to ask you about employee ownership as part of, a company's commitment to equity, diversity, inclusion, social justice. But I'd be interested in your views on that. But there are technical questions about, for example, whether lending criteria for employee owner transitions are different than other leveraged buyouts, or whether employee ownership businesses, and Cindy, this may be a question for you, have different transparency or public reporting requirements than other kinds of firms. So again, interested in the question of EDI, and employee ownership is a part of that, but also we're starting to get lots of technical questions. So if people feel comfortable addressing some of those, that would be great as well. Christine?
Okay, thanks. I'll start with the first one and end with the second and open it up for other people as well. And I think, we talked a lot about the local communities and some of the positives of employee ownership, but I think one of the things to really just double down on is that ability that this has to provide that social good. And, at BMO, we have a purpose to boldly grow the good in both business and in life. And I think, many other companies are also very interested in what their impact is and what they can do as part of their purpose to improve the communities that they are in and the people that they work with. And I think that the outcomes, again, that we've studied over many years of doing this are just so incredible that it's hard to not recognize what they can do. And there were studies that have been done by the National Center for the Employee Ownership that found that visible minorities, participating in an employee-owned company, earn wages 30% higher than their peers. Women owners, almost 20% higher than their peers. Matthew mentioned earlier Publix, which has proven stories of a cashier who worked at Publix who retired with over $1 million in their share account. We have a client who was recently on a panel with us, Stephen Smith, who's the CEO of Amstead, and he talks about walking across the shop and having one of his shop workers come up to him and celebrate because he was now a millionaire as a result of the employee ownership. And so I think it's proven the positive impact, especially for leveling that playing field of many groups that have been historically disaffected, is what's so important in this. So that's why we think that this can be such a win-win for everybody involved: the business owners, the employees, and the communities. And so, from an EDI, that's piece. From a technical piece, again, there are parts of this, and there's different ways that they can be structured as well, but it does involve debt, right? So there are things that do come around with being able to repay that debt. So there's analysis that is done, and I think there's lots of opportunities and options that we could look at for ways to ensure that there's appropriate incentives and ways that debt can be provided. Again, we've been doing this for over 40 years in the US, and there's learnings, and I think there's learnings in the US and the UK on ways to do this and ensure that it's available as needed to facilitate the transition in a way that makes sense, because it does involve incurring debt initially and then that debt getting repaid in time with the company. So there would be a lot of technical things around that, but fundamentally, again, it's been proven in the US and the UK, and I think there continues to be opportunities for us to continue to look at what's working well and what we can also learn from in Canada as we roll this out to ensure that it's broadly available as would be beneficial for all companies.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to go to Cindy now with kind of a multi-parted question. Cindy, hopefully you can work it through, because I'm trying to integrate as many of the questions as possible. Like, some of the questions, again, are technical, like what happens when an employee leaves. And my understanding, depending on the specific of the policy design, but they get their ownership shares transferred to them based on their value. But if you want to speak to those kinds of specific questions, that would be great. I guess the multi-pronged question, Cindy, is if you wanted to pick up on are there different reporting requirements for employee-owned businesses? And what are the one or two pieces of advice you would give to Canadian governments and Canadian policymakers as we set these up? What mistakes should we not make? What are the best designs? I know it's a very broad question, but I'm going to turn it over to you. I know you have lots of experience with these things.
Yeah, why don't I just start with just a little brief about how an ESOP works, just because that'll help with the employees leaving and all that. So with an ESOP, as a let's say you paid $1 million and you have that in shareholder debt, and you're going to pay 1/10 of that off every year. That, as the debt is paid off, those shares that are related to that debt get put into employees' accounts, and it's done as a percent, generally as a percent of pay. It can never err on the highly comp side, so you can do things that are equal or something like that, but we'll just say percent of pay. So every year you're getting money put into employees' accounts, and it is the company that is paying down that debt. It's between the ESOP and the company is paying down that debt. So the company is making that contribution, and that's where the incentives come in to help the company to want to have the affordability to do this. And we'll get to that in a second. So anyway, so you're putting money into the employees' accounts every year, and then there's people that are leaving. The company has to pay that money as they leave. So all the combination of paying down the debt and the people are leaving are going into all the existing employee accounts. So that's the simplified version. So when an employee leaves, there's a payout schedule. For us, they have to wait 5 years and then we start to pay them out. Because in the US, it is a retirement program. I don't suggest that necessarily for Canadian if we want to make things simplified. So we are required from a record keeping standpoint. We are over 100 participants in our ESOP, so we do get audited. Our ESOP actually gets audited just like you do for your financial statements, but you absolutely have to provide documentation as a part of your end of years for your ESOP. It is regulated by, for us, it's ERISA, which is our retirement plan. And I do recommend that there is that it is regulated, because if you're going to have incentives, you need to make sure people aren't abusing it, right? You want to make sure that it's being done correctly, because it is the wealth of the employees that we're looking to take care of, right? So that's sort of a very quick and dirty. The pieces of advice, one is that it is complicated to do an ESOP or an employee ownership transaction. But remember, when you get bought by private equity or whatever, that's complicated too. And so when we talk about the expense of it, I'm like, it's expensive to do the other one too. So I'm sometimes confused by that it is expensive. Yeah, it is. And it is expensive for either one. So, but these incentives, the reason why we want to have some incentives is, one is many times if you're selling to your employees, you may not get that top dollar that if you're looking at fair market value versus a strategic buyer or private equity. So there is a piece which is the owner has to be willing to look at this and say, this is the best for us. And that I might be able to get $2 a share more from someone else's. So there's that pull. And so the incentives partly are to incentivize the owner also to think about this model, have some incentives so that they go this route, because we have to do something to stop the wealth inequality, or we're going to have the entire world owned by private equity. So we have to have something that's saying this is a really important model, this wealth equality, and that we want to get money in the hands of all, not in the hands of few. So there's been incentives in our past. Christine, you probably can speak to that. There used to be an incentive for interest rates for banks. And I really like that option, because it's hard for us companies to get you have seller financing, but what if your seller's 80 or 85? They don't want a 20-year loan. So you have to have access to capital. So having banks being willing to give money. But then the other is, what's the incentive for the shareholder? We do have an incentive, which is that you can take a portion of the money that is given to the selling shareholder, and that they can have a deferred or potentially a no tax event if it goes into their into their future family if they pass away. So there are incentives out there for tax deferral for the selling shareholder. There's also tax incentives for the company itself for having an ESOP. So the combination of all of that makes it palatable for, I think, the selling shareholder. It makes it more affordable for the company. And hopefully, if the bank had some incentives, that you'd have all of that group working together to really have incentives. I sort of stayed up at this level, but Matthew, is there more you wanted me to? I don't. You go into detail, and I could talk all day. So.
No, I think that's great, because you've highlighted a couple of key pieces, and I'm going to, Chad, turn to you in a second to engage with a couple of them. You've highlighted a couple of key pieces around incentives and really kind of equalizing the floor, because there is private equity or competitors, and you want to make sure that if an owner, and I'll come to you on this, Tim, is interested in undertaking this path, it isn't done in a way where it is much less financially viable for the business owner. So, and you've also highlighted, Cindy, how many specific policy decisions are embedded in this. But Chad, let me ask you, because you have experience with employee ownership now for, as you say, at Friesens for 60 years. Why do we need new legislation? What is missing here? And why is this a big deal for you or businesses like you?
Thanks, Matthew. Can I make one point on Cindy's topic that Cindy just spoke to? So what we're advocating for is a freedom within a framework. So for instance, at Friesens, we don't treat employee ownership as a retirement component. We deal with it on a dividend basis. And so essentially I don't want to go into necessarily the details of how it works, but I want to make sure that we don't leave people with the impression that we're advocating for a very specific way of running an employee-owned company. There's numerous ways to do it. We're looking for the framework that allows companies to make those decisions. And so what we're trying to advocate for why do we need legislation? Because we've had to really piecemeal our employee ownership program together over time. And what we're trying to do as a coalition is, one, make it easier, two, make it give some motivation to actually get it done, and then three, want it to be inclusive, and so that it's not just about the privileged few that have the resources to be able to buy into stock in a company, that it's a very inclusive and broad-based model. And so the current trusts, I'll talk about two specifics. One is trusts. The trust makeup in Canada is challenging. And number two is the lack of incentives is challenging. Those are really the two big nuggets that we're trying to get across the line with the federal government. And so today, the way we're owned by trusts that have a 21-year maturing date, which essentially creates a capital gains event for any assets held in the trust at that time. And so what the 21-year rule does, it creates sort of a unnecessary financial pressure on the company to be thinking about redemption of those assets or setting aside cash for a potential capital gains event that's going to happen in the future. Both of those things may be drawing cash out of the business at a time when it shouldn't be pulled out of the business. And so rather than fueling new innovation and fueling CapEx and a bunch of the things that go into a thriving business, because of this arbitrary 21-year rule that's associated with current trust models, now we have to think about how to redeem, how to set aside cash, et cetera. And so we're advocating for a trust model that's dedicated to employee ownership, that can hold assets in perpetuity, that you don't have to continuously be working towards this tax capital gains tax event. And ultimately it fits with the intent of the government, which is we want these businesses to continue to grow, to continue to add employees, spend money on the growth of the business rather than trying to deal with a trust event. So that's number one. We're advocating for a dedicated trust model, but then we're also advocating to incentivize owners. We are asking a lot of owners. We're asking them to, many of them, to sell their business at a bit of likely at a discount versus what they'd be able to sell it for in those other external parties. Two, it's more work. It's more work. It's not just a financial transaction. You're actually dealing with a cultural transition of the business. And so you're asking an owner that's maybe in their 70s, maybe even in their 80s, to now not only finance a good portion of the transaction, but you're asking them to do more work, take on more risk, and so we believe that the financial incentives for the sellers is absolutely critical, and that they have some tax. Yes, we want to have some tax advantages to selling your business to an employee-owned ownership model. And ultimately what that means, and I think one of the concerns of government, is we don't want to be seen as incentivizing wealthy business sellers. But what we're advocating for is we need to put those incentives in place for hundreds or thousands of business owners so that we can benefit hundreds of thousands, or in the US case, millions of employee owners for decades. And so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to interrupt you. We have, that was super helpful. We have 4 minutes left. And so I want to go to each of you for a final thought. And so to Tim and Cindy and Christine, kind of a main message in terms of what the government needs to get right in kind of 45 seconds. But Chad, I want to start with you, and just you've been talking about what the coalition is advocating for. So again, in kind of 45 seconds, how do you think that's going? Do you think we will see positive change in the next budget?
I'm not in the business of predicting our government's decisions, but I believe that the trust structure has got a lot of momentum, and it's a nonpartisan momentum as well, support from all different areas. I think the tax incentive component needs some support. And so do I believe something is going to happen? I do. Will it be all that we believe is necessary to move things forward in Canada with employee ownership? Therein lies the challenge.
Thank you very much, Chad. Tim.
Yeah, I think I mentioned at the start that I'm passionate about the idea of stakeholder capitalism. And I'm also a systems change guy. So it's one thing for me as an owner to be committed to this path. And I think it's certainly important to look in the mirror and lead by example. But also, by my understanding, there's trillions of dollars of economic value that will be sold over the next decade just because of demographics, by business owners and transitioned. And this is a moment, actually a demographic moment, where we really need to capture the opportunity as a society to have those businesses transition, in a positive direction. My understanding is that the UK implemented legislation like this only a couple of years, or a decade ago, and already hundreds of businesses that wouldn't have otherwise transitioned. So if we don't get these incentives right, particularly the tax incentives for selling owners, I might do it. The Friesen family, 100 years ago, made this choice. But we need hundreds of business owners to seriously consider this path in order to keep this wealth in the hand and control in the hands of Canadian workers. And I think the moment is urgent, and this is a critical priority, and one that should absolutely be bipartisan. There's no question that this is a policy that will pay back dividends for the country.
Thank you, Tim. Christine.
Thanks. I don't want to reiterate too much. Just what we are recommending is a clear structure written into the federal income tax with specific rules and guidelines that are easy to understand. So, that's critical. The incentives, and again, there needs to be the tax incentives to encourage the owners to sell, because that the benefit of doing it that way, and everybody's talked about that. And the last thing that maybe hasn't been mentioned yet is we do need some oversight to protect the employee owners and the public interest. So, that's a piece of it as well. Thanks.
Cindy.
So to maybe summarize a few things. One is we need to face the wealth equality issues, and we've got this big opportunity, as Tim mentioned, to be able to help support companies to become employee-owned. This is, in the US, a nonpartisan issue, so I hope also in Canada it should be a nonpartisan issue. Also, the incentives are really important, and like Christine said, you do have to help create that structure so people do understand how money goes in and out of the employee accounts and doesn't make it onerous on the company to be doing it, in all different ways. Giving that structure is super important. But the last thing that I'll add that maybe hasn't been said then is you could have all of these incentives, but if nobody knows about them, that's not going to be helpful, right? So how do you get boots on the ground so that every province knows, everybody knows how to do it? Where are you? How are you getting out to the business owners so that they know about employee ownership and that they know about these incentives? That is a really, really crucial point, or it's going to just be there and no one takes advantage of it.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Those are really good messages to end on. And before I turn it over to Joseph, I just want to say, if people do have more specific questions or want to learn more about this work, the website is employee-ownership.ca. So please check out the resources there. So thank you to everyone, and back to Joseph.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Christine, Chad, Tim, and Cindy, thank you for taking your time out of your lunch hour to join us today. The Canadian opportunity for employee ownership is compelling. And I think that we are all very much inspired by the real life experiences that you shared with all of us today. But there's still clearly work to be done to establish the policy frameworks to make this happen at scale in Canada. I think we can come away from the conversation in full agreement that the differential outcomes supported by people, planet, profits are really exciting and more than worth the work. Matthew, thank you again for your expert guidance of our conversation today. And thanks once again to our event sponsor, Stikeman Elliott, and our season sponsor, Canadian Bankers Association, for making this complimentary event possible today. Canadian Club's vision is to be the podium of choice for relevant and provocative conversations, connecting the business community and promoting an inclusive and prosperous Canada. We aim to achieve this vision at every event, and clearly today was not an exception. Thank you so much for being part of it, everyone. Just one final note, please join us in person or online on March 7th on the eve of International Women's Day, when we host Rania Llewellyn, CEO of Laurentian Bank, Canada's first female CEO of a Canadian chartered bank. Thank you once again to everyone for spending your lunch hour with us. Stay healthy and look forward to seeing you again soon.